Hi, this is Fernandi back again to read another chapter or two of Chasing Vermeer by Blue Balliett. Chapter 2, The Letter is Dead. The letter is dead. It was a strange thing for a teacher to say. By the 6th week of 6th grade, Mrs. Hussey wasn't a disappointment. She had announced on the first day of school that she had no idea what they were going to work on that year, or how. It all depends on what we get interested in, or what gets interested in us, she had added, as if this was obvious. Calder was all ears. He had never heard a teacher admit that she didn't know what she was doing. Even better, she was excited about it. Mrs. Hussey's classroom was in the middle school building at the university school in the neighborhood known as Hyde Park. The school sat on the edge of the University of Chicago campus. John Dewey, an unusual professor, had started a century earlier as an experiment. Dewey believed in working on relevant projects in order to learn how to think. Calder had always liked the man's appropriate name. Not all teachers at the U, as it was called, still agreed with Dewey's ideas, but Miss Hussey obviously did. They began the year by arguing about whether writing was the most accurate way to communicate. Petra, who loved to write, said it was. Kids like Calder, who hated it, said it wasn't. What about numbers? What about pictures? What about plain old talking? Mrs. Hussey had told them to investigate. They took piles of books out of the library. They found out about cave art in France, about papyrus scrolls in Egypt, about Mayan petroglyphs in Mexico, and about stone tablets from the Middle East. And they tried things. They made stamps out of raw potatoes and covered the walls with symbols. They invented a sign language for hands and feet. They communicated for one whole day using nothing but drawings. Now it was almost mid-October. Would they ever study regular subjects like the other classes did? Calder didn't care. What they were doing was real exploration, real thinking, not just finding out about what a bunch of dead, famous grown-ups believed. Miss Hussey was cool. D-E-A-D, she had written it on the board. They were talking about letters that morning because Calder had groaned about having to write a thank you note and said that it was always a waste of time. No one cared what you put in a letter. Then Miss Hussey asked if anyone in the class had ever received a truly extraordinary letter. No one had. Miss Hussey looked very interested. They ended up with a strange assignment. Let's see what we can find, Miss Hussey began. Ask an adult to tell you about a letter they will never forget. I'm talking about a piece of mail that changed their life. How old were they when they got it? Where were they when they opened it? Do they still have it? Petra, like Calder, was fascinated by their new teacher. She loved Miss Hussey's questions and her long ponytail and the 3 rings in each ear. One earring had a small pearl dangling from a moon, another a high-heeled shoe the size of a grain of rice, another a tiny key. Petra loved how Miss Hussey listened carefully to the kids' ideas and didn't care about right or wrong answers. She was honest and unpredictable. She was close to perfect. Miss Hussey suddenly clapped her hands, making Petra jump and setting the little pearl earring into orbit. I know. Once you find a letter that changed a life, sit down and write me a letter. Write me a letter I won't be able to forget. Petra's mind was already racing. Calder pulled a pentomino piece out of his pocket. It was an L. He grinned. L for letter. This letter was definitely not dead. L was one of the simplest pentomino shapes to use. Most letters, the kind you mailed, were rectangles, he realized, just like an accurately put together pentomino solution. L was also the 12th letter in the alphabet and one of the 12 pentominos. Today was the 12th day of October. Calder's grandmother had once told him that he breathed patterns the way other people breathed air. Calder sighed. If only thoughts didn't have to be broken down into words. Too much talk was hard to listen to, and writing for him was a brutal process. So much got left unsaid. Sorry, so much got left behind. Miss Hussey ended the class by saying, "Got it? First find, then do. Who knows where this will take us?" Calder and Petra lived on Harper Avenue, a narrow street next to the train line. Remember, this is where they live. They live over here, and their school is over here. Right? Their houses were 3 blocks away from the U school and 3 houses away from each other. They often passed on the street, but they had never been friends. Families came from all over to study or teach at the University of Chicago, and many of them lived in this part of Hyde Park. Since most parents worked, young children traveled on their own around the campus and to and from school. On the afternoon of October 12th, Petra walked home from school with Calder half a block ahead of her. She watched him fish around for his key and open his front door. She knew his pockets were full of puzzle pieces. He sometimes muttered things and always looked like he had just woken up. He was kind of weird. Scuffing through the first fall leaves, Petra drifted into the game she often played with herself. Ask a question that doesn't have an answer. Why was yellow cheerful, she wondered. And why was it always a surprise, even when it came in an ordinary shape, like a lemon or an egg yolk? Picking up a yellow leaf, she held it in front of her face. Maybe she would write to Miss Hussey about this. She'd ask her if she agreed that humans needed questions more than answers. Calder, at that moment, looked out his front window to see Petra walking by holding a leaf several inches from her nose. He knew he was kind of weird, but she was exceptionally weird. She was always by herself at school and didn't seem to care. She was quiet when other kids were loud. Plus, she had a fierce triangle of hair that made her look like one of those Egyptian queens. Calder wondered if he was becoming just as much of an oddball. No one had asked him what he was doing after class that day. No one had told him to wait. He'd taken his buddy Tommy's presence for granted. Not now. Tommy Segovia had lived across the street from Calder until this past August. They had been great friends since 2nd grade, when Tommy poured his chocolate milk on Calder's bare legs and asked him how it felt. A teacher rushed over, and Calder had explained that it was an experiment and that it felt just perfect. That was the first of many collaborations. He and Tommy had decided back in January that they weren't going to be mediocre kids. Mediocre meaning just average, right? A little bit less than average. They swore they were going to do something important with their lives, solve a great mystery, or rescue somebody, or be so smart in school that they'd skip grades. That was the same day Calder had received his first set of pentominoes. A cousin in London had sent them as a 12th birthday present, even though Calder's birthday wasn't until the end of the year. Here's a picture right here, right? This is Petra walking by with her triangle of hair and holding the yellow leaf, and there's Calder in the window of his house, just a few houses, 3 houses down from hers. The pentominoes were yellow, interesting, plastic, and clacked against the kitchen table in a satisfying, decisive way. Determined, Calder moved the shapes into one combination after another, flipping and turning them. The biggest rectangle he had put together so far was 6 pieces. A breeze was coming in the back door, and some mourning doves that had nested on the back porch were cooing, making that slippery, burbling sound that Calder always associated with summer in his neighborhood. Every detail of that morning with Tommy was strangely clear. At once, Calder had known what to do. The Y had to slide into the U, which had to fit next to the P. He even remembered the sequence of the letters. Yup, Y-U-P. He'd gotten his first 12-piecer and gotten it fast. When he looked up afterward, he saw that the pentomino shape echoed in the kitchen. The hinges on the cabinets were L's, the water faucets were X's, the burners on the stove stood up and on neat N legs. Maybe the entire world could be communicated in some kind of pentomino code, kind of like a Morse code. He knew at that moment that he would be a great problem solver. Or so he told Tommy, who punched him in the arm and told him he had a swelled head. Yup, he'd said with a grin. Calder's head didn't feel too swelled these days. He looked at the clock. He was already late. When Tommy moved away, Calder had taken over his job at Powell's Used Books. Calder helped out one afternoon a week, delivering books in the neighborhood and unloading boxes. With Tommy gone, it was something to do. Calder gulped a glass of chocolate milk, stuffed a cookie in each cheek, and set off at a run. Powell's was one of Petra's favorite places. It was peaceful, and you never knew what you might find. It looked more like a warehouse than a store. Books were piled everywhere, and the rooms were jumbled together in a mismatched way. Although Petra had been inside many times, it always felt like a labyrinth. One dimly lit area led to the next, and suddenly you were back where you started without knowing how you got there. No one asked if you needed help. No one frowned if you read but didn't buy. Petra's mom had sent her to get milk and bread at the grocery store around the corner. Powell's was on the way. Petra had just settled herself on a footstool with a copy of Kidnapped. That's by Robert Louis Stevenson. When she saw a long ponytail whip by. Miss Hussey? Petra stood up carefully. She peeked around the corner, ready to pretend to look surprised. There was no one in sight. Petra looked across a rows of cookbooks. She tiptoed carefully through the next room, past English, history, psychology, and pets. She only wanted to see what Miss Hussey was reading. Darn, the next person she saw was Calder. He was bending over a box of books, a piece of paper in his hand. Don't turn around, don't turn around, don't turn around, Petra thought. She didn't want anyone from the class to see her spying. She tiptoed around the next corner. Miss Hussey was crouched by the art books. Petra couldn't see what she was looking at, but she noticed several paperbacks next to her on the floor. Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler. Miss Hussey moved suddenly, and Petra jumped backward. To her surprise, Calder was right behind her. He had obviously seen what she was doing. Petra cupped her hand quickly as if to cover his mouth, but stopped before she touched him. They looked equally shocked. Calder, recovering first, peered around the corner. He ducked back in a flash. She's coming. It felt too late to do anything but hide, so they hurried out of history and into fiction. Miss Hussey was at the front desk now. She plopped down her books and began talking to Mr. Watch, the man with red suspenders who was usually at the cash register. They were laughing. Did they know each other? Can you see what she has? Petra whispered. Calder walked quickly behind their teacher, his eyes on the counter. Miss Hussey never turned her head. Murder and a big art book. Never something, he muttered to Petra when he returned. Miss Hussey left the store with her purchases. A moment later, Petra ducked outside, empty-handed, her cheeks burning. She was furious with herself. Powell's had always been her private hideaway, her refuge. Now she'd spoken to Calder there. She'd practically attacked him. And he'd seen her spying on Miss Hussey. What had she started? Let's stop there for now.